Hi, I'm Joe with JTV. Today we're going to be talking about what makes pearls special and the different varieties, but mostly we're going to talk about farming and farming in the South Seas, which is one of my favorite things to talk about. You might wonder what makes a pearl beautiful. You might wonder what makes them feel so good. Well, it's where they come from and how they are cultured that matters. So we talk about rarity in the South Seas, but we're going to talk about freshwater a little bit later. But in the South Sea world, we talk about the rarest to the least rare. So that doesn't mean there isn't high quality. That doesn't mean they aren't enjoyable or beautiful. It simply means that they're harder to make, they're harder to come by. So in the South Sea world, we start with the Akoya Pearl, which is in the northern waters, typically near Japan, a little bit colder. And then we go into the South Seas, which are warm and tropical, where we have the three, I call them superstars of the South Sea world. We have the Pinctada maxima white lip from Australia. We have the Pinctada margaritifera from French Polynesia, Tahiti, Bora Bora, which is slightly less rare than the Australian pearl. And then we have the Philippine golden pearl, which is the rarest of the South Sea golden pearls and is cultured in a very special and unique way, which we'll talk about. But first, let's talk about what is a pearl, really. A pearl is essentially three things. It's made of three components, which is calcium carbonate, aragonite, which is the mineral form of calcium carbonate, and conchoidine, which is a protein matrix, believe it or not, similar to rhino horn. And rhino horn is very tough, very durable. And these three elements come together to create what we call a pearl. So originally, pearls were found naturally, and it was really hard. You had to harvest a lot of oysters to find a pearl, especially one that was high quality and beautiful. But eventually, Mikimoto, in the late 19th century, through a lot of trial and error, he created the ability to culture pearls, which is mostly what we do today in how he did it. And that is, we take a donor oyster, which is going to have what we call a SIBO, which is a small piece of mantle tissue from that oyster. We're going to put it into a host oyster, which is going to carry that with a nucleus. Now here's a surprising fact most people don't know. The nucleus of all cultured South Sea pearls comes from the United States. It's a mollusk that grows in three places: Tennessee, Ohio, and the Mississippi rivers. So every South Sea pearl has in its heart a little bit of the United States, which is really kind of fun. So in the case of how this first started, again, a lot of trial and error took place, but eventually it was discovered that if you took the nucleus and the SIBO, a little piece of tissue from the donor oyster, and put it into the oyster that's going to carry it, you would, over the course of time, create a South Sea pearl. So again, the magic about this is that you have to have people and oysters working together in nature to create cultured pearls. It's not something that can be done without passion, without care, without commitment. And that's what makes these pearls so special. That's what makes them feel beautiful when you wear them. You might notice when you put on a strand of South Sea pearls, they're cool to the touch, but then they take on your body warmth. And then all day long, you can feel that beautiful silky nacre that makes them feel so special. Again, when we talk about how pearls come to be, the culturing process is very meticulous, but it's also very unpredictable. So when we talk about rarity in pearls, we talk about the harvest. So of all of the pearls that are cultured, of all of the nuclei that are put into oysters, very few come out to be beautiful pearls. That's where rarity comes into play. So it's not that we can't do this, and it's not that the oysters don't cooperate, but so many things have to go right in order for the pearl to come out correctly. And we grade pearls on a variety of factors. The most important is size, then there's shape, then there's color, then there is what we call skin purity, or the lack of imperfections on the outside of the oyster, and finally luster. How bright, how alive is the color play in a pearl? And when we factor all these things in, it's really, really, really rare to get one pearl that matches all of these criteria. And again, we're going to talk about rarity. So we have three oysters: Pinctada maxima white lip from Australia, Pinctada margaritifera from Tahiti, and Pinctada maxima gold lip from the Philippines. Let's talk about how this works as far as how they are in fact cultured. The most amazing part is the technique. In Australia, Oysters are harvested from the wild in a very environmentally controlled process where divers are literally pulled across the ocean floor, and they have a bag on their hip, and they literally scoop the oysters off the ocean floor as they're being pulled by the boat on the seafloor. It's very dangerous work, but it's the only way they can harvest enough oysters to culture. In Tahiti, French Polynesia, Bora Bora, it's called lagoon culturing, and they're shallow pools, and the oysters are literally hung in these shallow pools, warm water, and they are cultured that way. In the Philippines and other areas around the Philippines, there will be what we call baskets that are put into the ocean, and the baskets hold 12 oysters, and these baskets are perpetually turned and cared for in order that the pearl comes out round, because oysters are affected by gravity, and so is the formation of the pearl, so you have to constantly be turning that basket. So what does all this mean? It means that in a course of about 3.5 years, you go from a little tiny piece of tissue and a nucleus to a finished pearl. And there are over 300 steps involved in each of those processes, but if you skip a step or you don't do it quite as well, you can't go back and do it again. And therefore, the harvest is the most important aspect of pearl culturing. In fact, in certain farms, if the pearl technicians have had a bad day or they're not feeling so good, they're not even allowed to touch the oysters, because it's been shown over decades of pearl harvesting that you can literally damage the oyster and the pearl if you handle it badly. So we protect them and make sure that they're healthy and well fed and taken care of every step of the way. There's just sort of a feeling when you hold these pearls that makes you feel amazing. They come from the ocean, they have the energy of the ocean in their formation, and they give you a little bit of that sparkle of what their lifespan has been in that beautiful water. It's sunny most of the time. It is really a lovely place to be, and the environment really speaks highly of how fine these pearls are. One thing you have to know is that oysters are very sensitive to the environment. So when we talk about successful pearl farming, we have to have a clean environment, otherwise the oysters will not survive. And it's a really easy way to tell, is the environment doing well, by the health of the oysters. So bear that in mind. This is a really strong collaboration between people and the oyster, and the environment is a big part of that. One thing to keep in mind through all this conversation is we just never know what the harvest will bring. And that's why pearls are so special and rare, because you just don't know what you're going to get. A lot of commitment takes place to get to the point of harvest, but you can imagine that you're sort of just taking a big risk every time you do pearl culturing, because you just don't know. So let's talk about freshwater culturing, sometimes called freshwater pearl farming. It's a completely different form, and typically it's done in a controlled environment, which makes it possible to have lots of really consistently beautiful pearls that lets us do things like make this 11mm freshwater ring. I mean, to find that size of pearl that nice in the South Seas takes a lot of time, effort, and energy, and of course that means that it's a more valuable price, whereas this is very affordable, very approachable, and opens up the world to more folks to enjoy cultured pearls. The difference really is this. You have the environment, which is unpredictable in the South Seas. You have the environment which is unpredictable in the northern Pacific, where Akoyas are cultured. But in freshwater farms, you control the water temperature, the amount of food, just the care of the oysters. It's very, very easy to do relative, not that it's easy at all, but it's relative to doing this in the open ocean. This is very, very much predictable, as we say. And predictability means less risk, because as we talked about in the South Sea pearls and in the Akoyas, the biggest risk is what will the harvest bring? We just don't ever know. Now in freshwater culturing, it's not a sure thing either, but the odds are really high that you're going to come out with beautiful and consistent quality pearls. And they make things like this, or we have a gorgeous bracelet, and you can see great luster, great nacre thickness, beautiful in the hand, and lovely on the arm. Again, colors are going to be about the oyster, or I should say in this case, it's a mollusk. I make that distinction because in culturing South Sea pearls or Akoya pearls, those come from oysters, but freshwater come from mollusks. You might think, well, an oyster, a mollusk, what difference does it make? it makes quite a bit of difference because there are special mollusks for culturing pearls in a freshwater environment. And again, we talked about the big three in the South Seas. So it does matter. But there's still a lot of dedication and skill required to create freshwater farmed pearls. And the results are stunning, yet they're very affordable. Look at this strand. This strand is remarkable. You can feel the weight of the nacre. You can feel the consistency of the shape and the size. And again, it's just as calming and pleasing as a South Sea strand would be. And you just have to love the sound of pearls. I know it may sound strange, but the sound of pearls is so unique, and nothing sounds quite like them, and nothing feels like cultured pearls. You know, men have started wearing pearls again, which is really kind of wonderful because at the end of the day, they're to be enjoyed by everybody. Now, as a gentleman, I enjoy seeing a lovely strand on a lady, but really, I also enjoy wearing them. And it takes a little getting used to sometimes for people to see gentlemen wearing pearls, but they have to remember, and you're perfectly fine to point out, that men originally were the ones who wore pearls because of how hard they were to harvest, especially the natural pearls. You know, it brings me to another point too, which is kind of important. I mentioned earlier that the ecosystem is really judged by the health of the oyster because if there's pollution or stress on the oysters or lack of food supply, these oysters don't do well. They're very sensitive to their environment. But when the early days of pearling came about, they harvested oysters for natural pearls, and they pretty much exhausted the ecosystem because they had to take so many out of the ocean in order to get just one strand. Thousands and thousands of oysters had to be harvested just to make one nice, beautiful strand. Culturing, however, changed all that because with culturing of pearls, you basically add oysters to the environment. Believe it or not, in the South Seas, when these oysters are making pearls, they're also spawning. And when they're spawning, they're creating new oysters, and the oysters are released into the wild. So they're actually increasing the population of natural oysters in the wild. Of course, they've been bred for hardiness and for basically color. So even in those cases where they're wild, you might come across a wild oyster that came from a farmed oyster that produces a beautiful pearl. You never know. Really interesting thing about pearl farming. The natural habitat for most oysters is the seafloor. And at the seafloor, there's a vast difference in temperature and food supply. In the early days of cultured pearl farming, it was discovered that there are strains of plankton that the oysters really grow with and grow quickly with, and in a nursery environment, which some pearl farms still use, they feed them these really very specific strains of plankton, and they grow pretty rapidly. When they're in the ocean, they're kept at a shallow depth, and the water is much warmer, and the food supply is greater than it would be on the ocean floor. And so these oysters have a very fast metabolism. They grow more quickly, they grow larger, and they can grow larger pearls. So much so that after one harvest, if the oyster is healthy and the pearl came out beautifully, we do what's known as a second and sometimes third graft. And what happens is that the oyster's gotten larger, the pearl sac that created the original pearl has grown as well, and now we can put a larger nucleus into the oyster and repeat the process. It doesn't take quite as long as the first time, which is usually 3.5 years from when the oyster's first nucleated, but it can produce a larger pearl. And then sometimes a really healthy and robust oyster that's created a second graft pearl is asked to create a third graft pearl. And now we're really asking a lot of this oyster. He's worked really hard his whole life. And so now we put the third graft in, which usually is what creates these large, plus 14 millimeter sizes. It's high sometimes, as in the case of Australian pearls, a 30 millimeter pearl. Not common, but it can happen. In the Tahitian pearls, we're still going to look at 18 as the upper limit. Sometimes you get a 20, based on the oyster species and its environment. In the Philippines, we've achieved pearls sometimes as large as 24, 25, 26 millimeters. Not often, but they do happen. But that's one of the things I think that really makes it special. And I talked before about spawning, and at the shallow depths, these oysters are healthy, they're vibrant, they're spawning into the ocean, and they're actually increasing the biopopulation of these animals. And remember that a lot of other sea creatures are supported by pearl farms. Barnacles, seaweed, sea grapes, tiny little crustaceans, and of course the big ones like the sharks and the eels, and particularly sea turtles. Sea turtles love oysters. I understand why. but they're a major predator of these. And what does one do in the open ocean about predation? Nothing. There's nothing you can do. The ocean was there before we got there. We share it with nature. And again, we're creating these beautiful pearls, so it's well worth it. You know, it's an amazing thing. When I talk about pearl farming, I talk about passion, about love, and commitment. In the open ocean, especially in the South Seas, in the Atlantic Ocean, we call these big storms hurricanes, and you can see how difficult it is to recover from that. In the South Seas, they're called typhoons. Basically the same thing, but it identifies where they're happening. And typhoons can either glance through a pearl farm and just cause a little bit of damage, or they can completely destroy a pearl farm. I've actually been witness to arriving at a pearl farm after a typhoon had hit, and I saw the devastation. Thankfully, they are built in such a way that those who work on the pearl farms can be safe while the typhoon is happening. It's still very scary, let me tell you, but at least they're built so that the people who work on these farms are kept safe from harm. But once they leave their shelters and they go out, they witness the destruction sometimes of an entire pearl farm. Not all of them, but certain ones that are in the path of the typhoon. And here's the thing that's really wonderful. Everybody comes together and starts over again, because this happens, unfortunately, quite frequently. And as time has passed, it happens even more frequently. But even so, there's a dedication and commitment to continuing that farm. And a lot of times what happens is the lines are broken and the baskets fall to the ocean floor. Here's the problem. You can't bring them back up again and have those oysters survive, because they've spent their entire life in shallow water, in warm water. They're just not used to the cold water at the bottom of the ocean. So they basically will perish, which is unfortunate. But at the end of the day, there's always a new cycle of life, and there's always a new commitment to bringing them back again. So we can hopefully enjoy these pearls for decades to come.